So Special Counsel Jack Smith has subpoenaed former Vice President Mike Pence to testify to the grand jury about the crimes of former President Donald Trump. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So friends, as you now know, Special Counsel Jack Smith, the prosecutor who has been appointed to investigate the crimes of Donald Trump, both the insurrection and the Mar-a-Lago documents crimes, has now served a federal grand jury subpoena on former Vice President Mike Pence to testify to the grand jury about the insurrection, in a very real sense, to testify about the democracy-busting crimes of Donald Trump. And what can Mike Pence bring to the table? Think about it. Donald Trump pressured Mike Pence relentlessly to try to convince him to corruptly throw the election to him, to Donald Trump, notwithstanding the fact that he lost the 2020 presidential election. He pressured Mike Pence, trying to convince him to violate any number of federal laws, violate the Electoral Count Act, violate the federal statute that makes it a crime to obstruct an official proceeding, the certification of Joe Biden's win. In a very real sense, friends, Donald Trump tried to enlist Mike Pence as a co-conspirator in his criminal scheme to commit crimes against the United States, to defraud the United States. And to Mike Pence's credit, he's no hero, but to his credit, he resisted. He refused to join Donald Trump's conspiracy, a conspiracy that so many others had joined. John Eastman and Rudy Giuliani and Jeffrey Clark from the Department of Justice, and so many others. Mike Pence refused. So because Mike Pence refused to join Donald Trump's criminal conspiracy, Donald Trump converted him into a victim, right? When Mike Pence was at the Capitol trying to certify Joe Biden's win, and it became clear to Donald Trump that Mike Pence was not going to do the wrong thing, was not going to help Donald Trump criminally, unconstitutionally retain the power of the presidency, Donald Trump tweeted out, Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what had to be done. And that inspired Donald Trump's already angry, enraged mob to begin hunting for Mike Pence and to begin chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." In a very real and direct sense, Donald Trump converted Mike Pence from what he hoped would be a co-conspirator to a victim. And when that crowd was hunting for Mike Pence and chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," Donald Trump did nothing. He did nothing to tell them to stand down. He did nothing to protect Mike Pence and his family and everybody in the Capitol that day. So does Mike Pence have some powerfully, sharply incriminating testimony to give to the federal grand jury about Donald Trump's crimes? You bet he does. So, what happens moving forward? What are the implications now that Mike Pence has in his pious little hands a federal grand jury subpoena? Well, first of all, he can try to fight it. He can try to claim executive privilege, and he will lose. Donald Trump's democracy-busting crimes will cause every single judge who has to resolve a Mike Pence claim of executive privilege to deny the executive privilege claim and order Mike Pence to testify. About that, I am certain, and I'm not going to waste a lot of time discussing executive privilege. If we start to hear concretely that Mike Pence is trying to play the executive privilege card, coward that he is, he might, you know what, we'll deal with it then. He will lose. and he will be ordered, he will be compelled to testify before the grand jury, and hopefully he tells the truth. Hopefully he doesn't shade and fudge and equivocate and try to give Donald Trump an out. Hopefully, for once in his life, Mike Pence is a stand-up guy, maybe the second time in his life, because after all, he did refuse to join Donald Trump's conspiracy. So what does it mean that somebody as high up on the food chain, somebody as influential and connected and privileged as a former Vice President of the United States has now been subpoenaed? Well, we can tease out a few things from the fact that Jack Smith, special counsel, has now reached up that high and subpoenaed Mike Pence. We can certainly infer from that Jack Smith is moving toward concluding his investigation. Not that Mike Pence will be the last witness, but when, I was a federal prosecutor for 30 years, when we are running large-scale grand jury investigations of conspiracies or of criminal organizations or enterprises, we generally start with the lower-level witnesses, right? The less important, the less critical, but witnesses who nonetheless have bits and pieces of relevant information, incriminating information about the targets of the investigation. And we try to go through all of those lesser witnesses first. Why? Because before we approach the big ticket witnesses, guys like Mike Pence, who had direct conversations with Donald Trump in which Donald Trump urged him to violate the law, we want to have as complete an understanding of the picture, of the evidentiary landscape as we can have. We want to know from all of those lesser witnesses, for example, what conversations did you have with Mike Pence? What do you know about Mike Pence and his interactions with Donald Trump or others? Because that makes us better prepared to fully question, to thoroughly examine Mike Pence in the grand jury if we know everything that everybody knows about Mike Pence and his interactions with Donald Trump. That's why I think Jack Smith is now reaching up to Mike Pence to put him in the grand jury. I am sure he's laid a lot of the groundwork by talking to and grand jurying, presenting to the grand jury, lots of lesser witnesses. And let me just add, as a footnote here, Jack Smith was only appointed on November 18th as special counsel, less than 3 months ago. And friends, he's been moving at light speed. He's been moving 100 miles an hour in the direction of accountability. That's the way it looks to me. And I'm not going to rehash my often heard complaints about the fact that Merrick Garland should have done these things a year ago, should have issued these subpoenas a year ago. That is water under the Justice Bridge. Let's talk about where we are. Because I think where we are now, with Jack Smith doing what he's doing, being aggressive, trying to obtain the vice president's testimony about the crimes of Donald Trump, is all for the good. We're going to let everything else go for the moment. So friends, what else can we glean? What else can we tease out of this most recent development? Well, we do know that there was some reporting about how Mike Pence's legal team had been in discussions with Jack Smith's team, with federal prosecutors, about perhaps coming in for a voluntary interview. We don't know the details about those discussions or negotiations, but it now looks like the powers that be have moved beyond a voluntary interview and have gone right to the grand jury subpoena. Why might that be? Well, maybe negotiations fell apart. Maybe Mike Pence and his team backed up or backed out and said, we are not going to come in for a voluntary interview. Or maybe Mike Pence and his lawyers said, you know what? If you serve us with a grand jury subpoena, we will come in and testify. Why? Because it will give Mike Pence some legal cover. He will be able to say, listen, I didn't voluntarily cooperate or sit down for an interview with the federal prosecutors, but I got a grand jury subpoena, and that is a court order directing me to appear before the grand jury and testify truthfully. So, I didn't want to sell out Donald Trump. I didn't want to go against him, but I had to comply with a lawfully issued grand jury subpoena. So maybe this was kind of a ploy so Mike Pence would have some cover, right? Because goodness knows he doesn't want to, lose whatever support he might have from Donald Trump's base. I have no idea who Mike Pence's constituency is. Was it the MAGA folks who wanted to hang him? Are those the people who are now going to, support him in a presidential bid? I doubt it, but still, Mike Pence apparently still thinks he's in play politically. I don't happen to believe he is. And will Mike Pence tell the truth when he goes into the grand jury? Anybody's guess. If he doesn't, and federal prosecutors have the goods to charge him with perjury, because if you lie in the grand jury, you don't tell the truth about the crimes of others, that's perjury. That can also be obstruction of justice, obstructing the grand jury's criminal investigation. It can also be accessory after the fact if you're trying to help Donald Trump get away with his crimes. So if he chooses to lie and try to cover up the crimes of Donald Trump, I hope he's held accountable for those crimes. Remember when the January 6th committee expressed an interest in having Mike Pence testify about the crimes of Donald Trump, about which Mike Pence knew. What did Mike Pence say? Congress has no right to my testimony. No, Mike Pence chose to cover up the crimes of Donald Trump, to bury them, to hide them from the January 6th committee, and by extension from the American people. He chose to secrete the democracy-busting crimes of Donald Trump. What does that tell you about Mike Pence? A couple of other questions that I've heard raised now that it looks like Jack Smith is subpoenaing the upper echelon of witnesses. What about Donald Trump? Is he going to subpoena Donald Trump? The answer is no. And here's why the answer is no. A subpoena is essentially a court order, right? It is the authority of the court directing somebody to testify before the grand jury. And the person that prosecutors are looking to indict, that's the person we call the target of the investigation, can't be compelled to testify. Why? Because the target of the investigation has a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, and boy, does Donald Trump know how to use it. We've seen that recently. So ordinarily, prosecutors do not subpoena the target of the grand jury investigation, the person they're intending to indict, because that person could simply walk in and plead the Fifth. And we couldn't trump that, no pun intended, unless we wanted to give that person immunity, and nobody is ever giving Donald Trump immunity for his crimes. So let me add, again as a footnote, the policies and procedures and rules that govern federal prosecutors in what's called the United States Attorney's Manual do provide for a prosecutor to subpoena the target of an investigation as long as they get the requisite approval up the chain, but it is rarely done. In my 30 years, I never subpoenaed a target because that's the person I was seeking to indict. I knew they had a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, and we don't just subpoena somebody for show to force them to plead the Fifth. So I predict Jack Smith will not and should not subpoena Donald Trump. Some other folks have said, what about Mark Meadows? He's got lots of incriminating information about Donald Trump. We've seen the text. I mean, text messages were flooding in to Mark Meadows, and he was acting as, treason central. Mark Meadows here, how can I direct your treasonous call or text? From everybody from members of Congress to Ginny Thomas, Justice Thomas's wife, for goodness sake. So Mark Meadows is also a very high value witness against Donald Trump, but he hasn't been subpoenaed as far as we know, or he has, and it just didn't leak out, or he's cooperating because he has criminal exposure. Maybe there has been a covert plea and cooperation deal struck with Mark Meadows. We don't know, but boy, has he been radio silent. That is perhaps a suggestion that he is cooperating in some form or fashion. But will he ultimately be subpoenaed? I don't think so, because he is also a target, I believe, of the federal grand jury probe. We know he committed the crime of obstruction of Congress by unlawfully defying a congressional subpoena. Again, the J6 committee sought his testimony about the crimes of Donald Trump, and he flat out refused, committing the crime of obstruction of Congress, for which he was criminally referred. DOJ didn't indict him for that, at least not yet, which was the wrong move on the facts and the law, but the right move on the tactics of it, if DOJ is planning to indict him as one of Donald Trump's co-conspirators. If that was the end game for the Department of Justice, then it makes some sense not to jump out and indict Mark Meadows on a standalone contempt of Congress charge. You don't want to do that. That would be premature. Wait until you bring the big conspiracy charge against Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, and Jeffrey Clark, and Roger Stone, and Steve Bannon, and Mike Flynn, and the fake electors, and the members of Congress who did things like give reconnaissance tours, and then asked for pardons because they knew they'd committed crimes on and around January 6th, and they wanted desperately to get away with those crimes. And there are so many others who it looks like are part of what we call a 371 conspiracy, a conspiracy to defraud or commit crimes against the United States. That's where we are right now, friends. This is good news. This is important news. This is news that forwards the ball toward accountability, toward justice. And we've been waiting a very long time. But we will never stop believing that justice matters. Friends, as always, please stay safe, please stay tuned, and I look forward to talking with you all again soon.